I'm Chris Hill. Welcome to Motley Fool Tech Weekly, joined by Eric Bleeker and Jason Moser. Let's start with something. We've talked about the battle for the living room before. Let's talk about the battle for the car, because Ford had been trying to work with Microsoft, sort of the technology in the car. Are they making a switch to Apple now?
Well, what we saw was our Worldwide Developer Conference a few weeks ago. Apple put on iOS 7. That got most of the attention. But another big feature was iOS in the car. Might be surprising to people because, as you mentioned, everyone's talking about battle for the living room, and all of a sudden just, hey, iOS in the car, we have all of these companies. I'll quick read a list. Chevy, Honda, Mercedes-Benz, Nissan, Kia, Infiniti, Hyundai, Volvo, Jaguar, Porsche, Acura. A veritable who's who of the industry. It makes a lot of sense, right? Because you put something embedded in a car, the lifetime of cars off in 10 years. Technology is going to be awful. My wife bought a car last year with the old iPhone connector in it. Can't be used anymore. 1 year obsolescence period. But you roll off a platform that's housed in a smartphone in your pocket or on the dash, that's going to be on a 2-year upgrade cycle. So you kind of outsource the need for technology in the car to a manufacturer who that's what, it's their bread and butter. Makes a lot of sense. What I do find interesting, though, is a couple holdouts from this. One is BMW with the ironically named iDrive system, not from Apple, and they are a notable holdout.
You don't think Apple's lawyers are putting together a letter to send over to BMW?
They probably have something on the way. But the other one's Ford, which has its Sync program, which is actually powered by Microsoft. But again, it runs into the problem that it's not in one of these connected platforms like a iOS or Android, where you naturally see that's where your media is stored, that's where your life is, your messages. There's a natural convergence to the car. And Ford's actually been dinged recently by J.D. Power for this. They've gone back to more buttons. And you have to wonder, how long can a car company like Ford kind of stick with a proprietary technology when it looks like iOS and, hey, logically Google will follow Android, will become industry standards here?
Do you think that, Eric mentions Google, do you think that with the deep pockets that Apple has, that Google has, does it make sense for them to really start moving heavily in the direction of automobiles? Because, it does sound like everyone's choosing up their dance partners, and they better get one quick.
Yeah, and I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you look at something like a Google and an Apple, and that's what they do very well, right? I mean, Apple particularly has done a great job of the hardware and sort of bringing the software and controlling that entire experience. But, I want to go back to something Eric mentioned. It was a great example there with BMW, and BMW is also sticking with their proprietary GPS technology in their cars. I believe it's supported by TomTom.
Well, maybe you don't want to switch to Apple on that one.
I don't know necessarily, but my wife drives one of those 1 Series, and the GPS system is less than stellar, okay? She complains about it a lot. When you look at something compared to something like a Google Maps, there's an argument to be made there, bringing Google and Apple into the car. And then you talk about something like a Tesla, where you get into that car, that's a steering wheel and a big touch screen, right? I mean, any upgrades to the car, the software, it's just you do these little downloads, and you upgrade the software in that car. So they're controlling that environment very well. And it all leads me to believe that, yes, we're going the way of the iCar. I mean, we're going to be having iHouses at some point. And so these car companies can look at it one of two ways. Either they need to figure out a way to develop an experience that's superior to something like Apple or Google. Well, good luck with all that. Or they need to integrate those systems into their cars. I think that the latter is probably the better solution.
I was just going to say, it seems like if you're, at Ford and you're arguing in favor, or any automaker for that matter, and you're arguing in favor of, we need to go our own way, we need to build our own system, that's got to be a tough argument internally.
I mean, it's a sunk cost, and people probably don't want to give that value away to another industry, but it's just not something you can win on in the long run. So
let's move from autos sort of to the business world, where, let's face it, Microsoft has essentially owned the business world, sort of the enterprise space. To what extent do you see, however, iOS starting to move in, companies starting to say, you know what, it's worked well, Microsoft Outlook, Excel, all of those systems, all that's worked well up until this point, but we feel like the next 20 years is going to be, we're going to be better served as a business if we just make a break from Microsoft and go with iOS.
Yeah, and I think this is really underscored by a recent study out from Gartner, which is a research firm, and they had basically looked at computing devices, and let's stop talking about PCs, let's stop talking about tablets, and just start talking about computing devices. And they had essentially looked at the combination of Windows and Windows mobile products, Android and iOS, and I've got the figures in front of me. In 2012, we already have Androids passing PCs and Windows devices. Within the next few years, though, by 2014, we could see iOS neck and neck with Windows here. And I think what's important, I remember back in like 2008 when the talk was, when will smartphones pass PCs? Yeah. Now it's Android has passed, when will Apple? And an important kind of point to make on this is, PCs are seen as, something still more higher end, a lot of smartphones are cheap. Androids look at the sub 100 department. If you combine Intel and Microsoft as the major domos of the PC space and kind of assume all the PC makers are breaking even on profits, Apple itself makes 50% more profit than Intel, Microsoft and Intel combined, and it makes 30% more operating profit than the two. So I think that just kind of underscores the lack of any need for delineation between PCs and smartphones, and just kind of says we have computing devices. And if you're not looking at the world that way, I don't think you really understand where the next 5 years are going in technology.
So having just talked about the opportunity for Apple in vehicles, is this the big fish in the pond now? Is going after this much more important, arguably, than automakers?
I think it is, and I think they're already going after it. And I think Eric makes a good point about PCs and how they are just becoming less and less of a key focal point. You just have to be focused more on your computing power. And the proliferation of mobile devices, I think, is really what's playing into Apple and Google's strength there, because as it stands, they're winning the mobile device war, right? Whether it's an iPhone or an Android phone or an iPad or some type of Android tablet. But to go one step further with that in our working lives, we want something that integrates well with our mobile lives as well. And mobile is becoming the priority. And so that's where I think Apple and Google, to a certain degree, have a great opportunity to produce tablets, not really tablets, but maybe laptops or working type devices that will integrate very seamlessly with our mobile devices. And the fact of the matter is they're doing a great job of building out software and hardware that not only works, but it helps sort of dictate our lives and teaches us new things and ways to do things. So I think that's where Apple and Google really have a great competitive advantage over something like a Microsoft at this point.
You mentioned Intel. Let's talk chip makers. Is Apple getting ready to partner up with a new chip maker here?
Well, when we look at the chip making space, they've been relying on Samsung to make their A series of processors. Hey, it doesn't take anyone out there to know they probably don't want to stick with this arrangement. And that kind of matches what Apple's doing. They're just so big, their supply chain, they need to diversify a little bit. You look at reports of the iPhone, the cheap iPhone or the iPhone Lite,
$100,
whatever you want to call it. Probably not that cheap, but we've looked at Pegatron, which is, they're so familiar with Foxconn as a manufacturer. The reports are all this Pegatron company making it. So when we look at the chip, their chip production, they want to get away from Samsung, but this is an insanely complicated change. And what they're looking at is going to Taiwan Semiconductor, and that's for their next big transition to, we call it 20 nanometers. And I know that could make someone fall asleep hearing 20 nanometers, but it is important to know because only 4 companies in the world have the resources to go down to this complexity. Those companies are Intel, Taiwan Semi, Global Foundries, and Samsung. Well, Samsung's off the board. They want to move away from them, so you're really left with 3 people. The thought is they go with Taiwan Semi because they're building out capacity. For some reference, they're supposedly getting phases 4, 5, and 6 of a new fab they're building. This fab is the size of 11 soccer fields. So you can just see the investment built out to handle everything Apple's doing. So I think, it makes a lot of sense, but what investors out there, need to realize is this space is getting so consolidated. Samsung was squeezing them on prices, and it's partially because Samsung knows they're moving, they're going to get what they get while they can. But also, the consolidation in this industry gives a lot of supplier power as well. And it's not like Apple has a ton of options. You're probably in the coming year going to be hearing 2 names, Taiwan Semi and Intel. And Taiwan Semi seems to be the one they want to go with.
I was just going to say, and you mentioned this is not a move that can be made quickly or easily when you're talking about chips. So how do you see the timing on this playing out? Is it well into 2014 that Apple makes a switch like this?
You need to have a clear break. So you have to have a new lineup move to the new foundry, and the older ones you can still have Samsung make. So I think they'll just basically start with a newer lineup on the next A series, whatever it might be, and then old ones will kind of fade away as they cease production on those products, and Taiwan Semiconductor will take more on.
Let's stick with Samsung. Their CEO came out recently talking about marketing. And I always find this interesting. I always think of Pepsi. Whenever Pepsi reports earnings, one of their executives always goes on CNBC, and one of the first things he's talking about is, we're spending so much money on marketing. And I'm not a Pepsi shareholder, but I always look at that and think, I don't necessarily want to hear about how much money you're spending. I want to hear about how much money you're making.
Sure.
And that's what Samsung CEO was kind of doing, was talking about how much money they're spending on marketing. That said, it seems to be working. What do you think when you see Samsung and the amount that they're spending on marketing?
Yeah, and the background, I mean, Samsung's obviously big in marketing, and Huawei, which is a competitor, basically said, all your successes are due to marketing. So it basically just said, hey, you spend a lot of money, so you're doing well. Doesn't really capture the full picture. Ad Age recently put out a study that Samsung, top increase in ad spending in the US last year, 58% just last year. All those Paul Rudd commercials, Seth Rogen, cost money. And they spent almost $1 billion, about $900 million marketing just in the US. And their marketing globally was approximated about $4 billion. But that's just one piece of it, is what people kind of misunderstand about the mobile space. The larger spend, they actually spend 25% more just on sales promotions. There's a very limited channel of where you sell people cell phones. And if you pay Verizon to promote your flagship phone, that costs money, and they pay way more on that. And more so than the brand advertising commercials, the iPhone people are sheep, what we're exposed to is just work with the carriers to be able to push their phones. And we're kind of seeing a little bit of that right now from Microsoft signing a deal with Telefonica. You know, if you can get carriers to push your product, you know, that's going to play a big part in your success. So yes, it is marketing, but also it's the dynamics. Nokia dominated the cell phone industry for a long time, even though all the user interface stuff was the same as the carrier for a reason. It is a space you can dominate pretty well if you can control that sales channel.
Yeah, to Eric's point, Microsoft just signed a one-year marketing agreement with Telefonica. For people who don't know, Telefonica has more members than Verizon and AT&T combined. It seems like it would be a smart move on Microsoft's part, but what do you think when you see all of this money being spent on marketing as an investor? Does it affect you at all? Does it color the way you think about the business? Or do you think, you know what, spending that kind of money, particularly when it comes to relationships with carriers to get them to push your product, that's money well spent?
Well, I think that there's a difference between spending money on advertising to people like us and spending money with the carriers to push your product a little bit more. So when I look at something like an Apple, you know, the one advantage that Apple has in this market that they've had for so long is that essentially the products speak for themselves, right? I mean, their reputation is as a premier hardware maker along with the software and experience to back it up. You look at something like a Samsung, and I would argue that Samsung has to spend this money on advertising and marketing to create that awareness, because a lot of us already know about Apple, but maybe we don't know so much about Samsung or its capabilities. And so you see those commercials that make fun of people waiting in line for the new iPhones. And I think those are very well made and well done. I think they have to do that. But, you know, I think it just lends itself to a greater point that you do have sort of a dilemma there between a product that speaks for itself versus one that doesn't. So when you look at sort of that Coke and Pepsi dilemma, like you mentioned earlier, Pepsi has to spend a lot of money on advertising and marketing because it's a lesser known name, right? I think Coke has done a greater job over the longer period of time generating a better reputation, creating awareness for its product on a global scale. And so when you see something like an Apple versus a Samsung, yeah, I mean, I think Samsung is going to have to spend more in order to create that awareness. But the bottom line is it's working because they're selling a lot of phones.
Yeah, and just one point off that, Verizon's, the CEO of Verizon Wireless has come out and said, people say, why don't you just push other phones? He goes, it doesn't make sense because the return rates are so much higher than the iPhone, we end up paying more money in the end. So it does go back, if you have a superior product, people switch when it change back, that sells itself.
Final question on this topic. If this is about how smartly companies can spend money and how much they can spend, doesn't that automatically tip the balance in favor of Apple because they got the deepest pockets?
They're not even the top 10 advertisers, so that's a huge part of their margin story. They don't need to spend to do this. Now, what the bear case on that is if their products aren't superior and they need to start spending, and they just don't get free marketing in movies. Every time you see an Apple product, they're not really paying for that. It's just placed. So if they lose that cachet, they lose a lot of marketing that they're not paying for.
All right, for Eric Bleeker and Jason Moser, I'm Chris Hill. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.